Coming up on Evolve the Earth Talk Show, we talk to Professor Suzanne Maher about our shifts of the world's climate and how our geography changes. All that and more coming up on Evolve the Earth. Welcome to another episode of Evolve the Earth Talk Show podcast. And today we have a special guest, Suzanne Maher. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really good. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, how did you get into geography?
I didn't intend to get into geography, I'll tell you that. So I got my undergrad in Earth Systems. I thought I was going to be an artist. It turned out I was really bad at it. And I took a GE geology class and just loved it. Okay. So I got my undergrad in Earth Science. And then I was recommended to go to a geography department a lot, actually, in my undergrad. And I was convinced that geography was just about maps, and I wasn't interested in maps.
Okay.
And so I never went. Okay. And then I finally... somebody put me in contact with somebody who was studying marine mammals, and I wanted to be on ships and learn about marine mammals. And so I met with her, and she was in the geography department, and then told me a little bit more about it. And so I applied and did geography for grad school.
Could you explain the discipline of geography?
Yeah, so it's kind of surprising. And so again, I think that most people think it's about maps or memorizing places around the world, and it is not really at all anymore. And so the discipline of geography is a description of Earth, but there's kind of two main fields in geography. So there's physical geographers, which I am, and then there's cultural geographers. Some people say that there's like 6 different splits, but I'm just going to say there's 2 in this. And physical geographers are studying the foundational studies of the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the biosphere, and the lithosphere.
Wow.
So understanding kind of Earth system science, but also even as a physical geographer, still really thinking about humans and how they're impacted by the physical space, and then how humans are going to change and alter the ecosystems and impact the environment. So it's kind of at the intersection of that. And cultural geographers are more focused on society and the development of society, but how the environment shapes that society.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Even the clothing that people wear in certain areas, or the way that we build our houses and build up the landscape, that's all completely controlled by your physical environment.
Wow.
And so looking at kind of that intersection.
Right. All right. Interesting there. In a typical physical geography class, what is studied?
Well, we never hit all the things we're supposed to hit, but we kind of, we start looking at our place in the cosmos, because that's going to control our temperature budgets. And so understanding our planet's revolution around the sun is kind of the beginning, and understanding seasonal change. And then from there, we study the atmosphere. We learn about the physics of wind and what gets wind in motion, the relationship with temperature and kinetic energy, and then into like storm systems, hurricanes, monsoons, El Nino, all of that good stuff. And then from there, you kind of have enough of the pieces to understand basic weather and meteorology, and enough to understand the climate systems. And that's just the first half. And then we go to geology. And so then we do like plate tectonics, earthquakes, volcanoes, the way that glaciers and water systems and desert systems are kind of carved by the physical processes in the atmosphere is the next step. So it's really kind of a study of Earth.
How is the field of environmental studies different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that is hard even for me to answer. So the one thing that I can kind of piece out that's a little bit different from environmental studies is that geographers are really focused on the idea of space and place. So geographers want to try to understand what makes a specific location on the planet unique. And what are all the kind of multidisciplinary pieces that shape that, right? And then trying to create a way to see that pattern in the landscape visually. So geographers have a lot of training using different types of software that creates like modern data-driven maps and graphics that you can kind of like have clickable layers and all of that. So with geography, it's like there's the focus on place and space, spatial distribution, and then the technologies that map that's like kind of more applied.
Right, and those technologies are rapidly moving up. What are the internal and external processes that shape the physical landscape?
Those are thinking about the surface of our planet as constantly changing, right? So, and this is a bit of a simplification. Our landscape is always in flux, right? So on a geologic timescale, the mountain range is shrinking and basin areas are filling in, right? And it's because of these internal and external processes.
Right.
So in a very general sense, there's certain processes that are building up the surface of the planet, like volcanic activity or folding and faulting, right? And that kind of stuff. And then there's the external processes like the wind and the rain and the river systems that are slowly wearing down the mountain ranges. And those processes are always happening so that the relief that we see on the surface is always changing.
So how do tectonic plates movements contribute to the formation of geographical features?
Well, that one, I mean, there's kind of a lot there, but the basic idea with that is that the surface of our planet is made up by all of these different plates of various sizes, and they're moving. They're just moving really slowly.
Right.
So the plates of plate tectonics are moving at like a centimeter a year, right? So not a lot. But where those plates are coming together, they can smash together and then build up and create massive mountain ranges, depending on the material of the plate.
Right.
And so you can get something like the Himalayan mountain range or the Andes, right? In other locations, when plates come together, one of them will subduct underneath the other one. And then when you push a plate down into the lower layers of the mantle, you're going to warmer temperatures. And so melt is generated. And then you get, volcanic features on the overlying plate.
Right.
But then there's other stuff too. Like if plates are moving apart, they can spread and thin and you can get cracks and molten material can work its way up. As the movement of the plates continues, it's creating different mountain ranges, volcanic regions, metamorphosing rock, like all sorts of different things are happening there.
What communities are the most impacted by earthquakes in the Bay Area?
Well, so there's a couple things. So one is thinking about the type of material where we live.
Right.
So it kind of depends on if your house is somewhere where there's a lot of bedrock, or if your house is in an area where there's a lot of fill.
Okay.
And there's kind of an interesting background with fill in the Bay Area.
Right.
So when people came to this area for the gold rush, they came on ships and they left them all in the harbor.
Okay.
And so we had all of these rotting ships in the harbor, and we didn't know what to do with them. And so the cities decided to just sink them. Right? Into the harbor. And so then you have all these rotting ships and they're like, well, we'll just dump some dirt on top of that.
Really?
So we needed to kind of build out and get more space was the idea. So you sink the ships, you dump rock and dirt on top of that, and then you've got a whole new section of the city that you can build houses on.
Okay.
But the problem is that if you have an earthquake that's really bad material,
it's not sturdy enough?
It's not sturdy enough. And so with the vibrations from an earthquake, it liquefies basically. And so that it behaves like a liquid and creates a lot of damage for those houses.
Wow.
So if you're in an area that has been built fill, you're really vulnerable to that. And then there's other areas where just the substrate is really kind of soft and unconsolidated, and so that's also not great.
Right.
But if there's bedrock, there's a lot less shaking.
Gotcha.
So knowing the type of geography that you have in your area is going to have a really big impact in how much damage there's going to be.
How does urbanization impact water systems and temperature?
If you think about an urban space, there's a whole lot of concrete, and that concrete is not permeable. So when we have a precipitation event, you're going to get a lot more localized flooding because there isn't anywhere for the water to go. But if you have a natural space, right, the water can percolate down into the soils, it can go down into the aquifers, and so it's not going to create as much overland flood. And so our water systems are much changed by how we have built up the space and impacted how permeable the soils are, right? So that's one kind of thing is we're changing our water systems, and that creates a lot of problems for us.
Right.
But the temperature stuff is really interesting because so there's this. So parks and forested areas, they have a much cooler temperature than the urban spaces. So if you have like a park inside a city, say it's a really hot summer day, that park may be as much as 10 degrees cooler as the surrounding urban space. And it's because of evaporation and transpiration of the plants, which is a cooling process. So as water changes phase from a liquid to a gas, it has to take heat energy and it uses that heat energy to propel it into a more energetic state. And that energetic state is going from a liquid to a gas. When you have a bunch of plants, there's a lot more opportunity for evaporation.
Okay.
And then the evaporative cooling process reduces the local temperature by about 10 degrees.
Wow.
Yeah, and then also they have, there's a lot of shade. Of course, they're beautiful and wonderful to be in, but I think it's important to kind of think about parks, not just for their sort of worth for society, but also like they play a really important environmental role, and we need them for that.
So more parks.
More parks, and they're just sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They're great. So we need more parks.
But what pollutants in the air contribute to health issues, and what preventative measures can be taken?
Yeah, so we're in an urban space. There's lots of pollution, right? Yeah. There's lots of different compounds that impact our health in negative ways. There are some primary groups that are the most abundant that cause the most damage. Carbon monoxide, and then nitrogen compounds and sulfur compounds and particulates, right, are kind of the four biggest groups. Having a carbon monoxide sensor in your home, if you can, is a really smart idea. And I mean, there's not a lot we can do about some of the pollutants, but that's one thing you can do in your home, and you should definitely try to get a carbon monoxide sensor. Property owners are supposed to provide those for you for free, so you should be able to get one cheaper. And so that's, one thing that you can do in your home. But the other thing is, like, on days where you have a bunch of forest fires and the air pollution's really bad, really consider wearing an N95, right? Reason for that is that particulates, like certain size designations of the particulates, when you breathe them in, they actually go into your lungs and like cut up the tissue. Yeah, and so if you wear a good mask in instances where you have high particulate matter, particularly the 2.5 designation, then you can like really kind of reduce some of the damage to your lungs. But ultimately, like nitrogen compounds, sulfur compounds, and particulates, like the end result is that all of those reduce our lung function. And so chronic exposure is more of an issue. Put a carbon monoxide sensor in your home if you can, but like the really big thing you can do is support clean air legislation, because that's what controls and limits the amount of those compounds and others that we know has a negative impact on our health. So thinking about ways to kind of support that legislation is really key.
Why is climate change a core area of study in geography?
Yeah, so climate change, microclimate, those are all really like big kind of areas of expertise in geography. Usually in community colleges, weather and climate systems are housed in geography. The reason for that is there's a really heavy focus in geography, particularly in physical geography, and understanding the physics of wind, being able to kind of model out where wind will move, also understanding then the whole structure. And so you have kind of all the foundational knowledge to understand why the climate types exist where they do, but then also with the focus on communities. And part of the core curriculum in geography is respecting the value of other cultures and their wisdom. And so in dealing with climate change, right, it's a global phenomenon. It's going to impact everybody. And so as we come up with solutions, we need to respect and value the wisdom that exists in all of the different communities. And then move from kind of a bottoms down approach going upward. So geographers are really trained to value and respect that, and then work with technologies to model that and tell a story using GIS technology that stores and processes and shows data.
How does climate change impact storms and weather?
Well, our storms are going to be worse and less predictable. Yeah. So for California, what that means is that we're going to get less moderate precipitation and more extreme events. So we're going to see more atmospheric rivers. We're going to see sort of heavy downfalls of rain instead of kind of moderate, soft rainfall for longer periods of time. And so those are what the projections are moving forward for California. So that's kind of how it's going to impact us, is we're going to see a much reduced snowpack, which is important for water storage. Also just going to see, more intense storms and then longer drought periods. So dry spells and then heavy rain spells.
How could climate change impact the global food supply?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So first off, I want to say that there's already talk about how we don't have enough food, and that's really inaccurate. We have tons of food, right? It's not a production problem, it's a distribution problem, right? So there's absolutely food shortages in areas where people don't have access to healthy food or can't afford to buy food. But that's a distribution problem, because then you have other parts of the world where they're throwing away 2/3 of the food supply. Distribution, first and foremost, and equitable distribution is kind of the bigger issue. But as climate change continues, what we're doing is we're changing our weather conditions and climate conditions, and we're moving them, right? Okay. So let's say we have an area that's perfect for growing wheat right now. So we're growing wheat there because it's great conditions for that. And we haven't built up that space with cities because it's really prime for wheat production. But because of climate change, that location is no longer going to be perfect for growing wheat. And instead, it's going to be maybe a little bit north. Yeah. But the problem is we might have a city there. So there's some interesting projections that say that like the optimal location for growing wheat is going to be kind of around the Great Lakes area up by Canada, but people live there, right? So it's like trying to think about how we're going to deal with those changing climate zones while at the same time making sure that we support our food supply.
Yeah. So you pretty much you can't just kick all those people out.
No. No, we have to figure out how we're going to deal with that. Yeah.
Beep beep beep. It's the professional driver with your driving hack segment. What is the best way to know the distance from the front of your car to the curbside? Before we get into that, we asked some college students how they do it.
I don't even drive yet. I'm still practicing.
I mean, my car drives itself, so I just let it handle the business, And if I can't, do it myself, I just call my dad. He does it for me,
I live in Oakland sometimes. Sometimes I don't even really park my car. I get out and ghost with them.
Just give it a little love tap, it won't hurt too much. Both cars will be just fine at the end of the day, just squeeze in the parking spot. That's how I do it.
Those were some interesting answers there. Let's get into our driver hack now. So what is the best way to judge the distance from the front of your vehicle to the curb? Well, all you have to do is pay attention to the left side mirror. When the bottom of that mirror coincides with the top of the curb, the distance should be about 10 centimeters.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll apply that next time I try driving.
Okay, yeah, so 10 centimeters. What's that, like 4 inches-ish?
Something like that, yeah.
All right, yeah, I'm pretty familiar with that, so yeah, I think I can do that.
Thank you for informing me. I will definitely keep that in mind.
All right, for sure. I'll let people know how, that's how it's done. I appreciate you letting me know.
Remember to drive safely and please be courteous. I am Alan Sampson reporting for Evolve the Earth. In what ways will climate change impact water resources in California, and are there any strategies for management looking forward?
Okay, so in California, our water systems are going to change with getting larger, warmer storms, heavy rainfall, less snowpack. And one of the big issues with that is that the snowpack stores a huge amount of our water, right? So we get this huge snowpack, and then that water slowly moves through the stream systems and supports industries and communities, agriculture, right, in the valleys all through the summer. So if we reduce that snowpack, we don't have water storage. And so there's a lot of different solutions for trying to figure out how to deal with that. But my favorite one is actually meadow restoration. We have a ton of these beautiful meadows in the Sierra Nevadas, but most of them are degraded because of land use, like cattle farming or railroads or transportation roads that kind of cut through these meadow systems and damage them. But pretty cheaply, if you bring in a bulldozer and kind of fix some of the stuff that has been damaged, they very quickly recover and restore. And what these meadow systems do is they create these beautiful wetland habitats in the high Sierras. They have these like basins of water underneath them. So basically you have like an impermeable layer of rock, and then it's filled with sediment and soils, and then you have a meadow system kind of above that. But that loose sediment and soils that are down below, that are like or above the impermeable layer, that can fill with groundwater. And so it's like a huge kind of underground lake, and you could think of it in that way. And then that stores all of this water and then slowly releases it through the summer months, just like the snowpack would. Nice. Right? So we have all of these incredible meadows that by restoring their ecologic health, they can become these huge reservoirs for storing water. Wow. And at the same time that they're doing that, they're increasing biodiversity. They're supporting a bunch of organisms, right? They're reducing local temperature. They're sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? And they're also cleaning the water so that it's higher quality by the time it gets down to lower elevations. So there's lots of solutions, but that happens to be one of my favorites.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, hopefully we can practice it more in the future.
Yeah.
How do changes in global climate patterns influence ecosystems and biodiversity?
Yeah, so an ecosystem exists because of the climate, right? So the climate, when you think about the climate, that's the precipitation and the temperature levels of a certain area. And then those conditions create an optimal environment for certain plants and organisms to live there. And then boom, you have your ecosystem, but it's dependent on the temperature and precipitation. So once you have kind of your ecosystem and all the organisms are living there, if it's doing well, you're gonna have your biodiversity, this healthy system. But because of climate change, what we're doing is we're changing the temperature and the precipitation. Then suddenly we have this location, right? Where the plants aren't doing as well because maybe it's getting drier or maybe it's getting too hot. As some of the plants start to die, then that impacts the species that live there. And so first our more sort of our least flexible organisms are gonna go, right?
You're right.
Yeah, so we have like, when you think about species, you've got your generalists and your specialists. And your specialists have very specific needs. They eat only a certain number of things that, you know, work for them. They have a very specific needs for their habitat. And so if you change the temperature, right, and the precipitation and therefore the plants, they're not flexible. They can't survive that, right? So biodiversity goes down because it's only our generalists that can survive those conditions, the ones that can eat a bunch of different things, so that if like 2 or 3 of their primary food staples disappear, they still have other things they can eat. So if their favorite habitat disappears, they might be able to make a couple other ones work. But what's happening in that is biodiversity is going down. So yeah, with climate change, we're seeing that biodiversity declines.
Can you elaborate on the current state of our forests in California and how forest health is impacted by climate change?
Yeah. So our forests are changing. And that's kind of a positive way to say that they're not doing well, right?
Oh, no.
But really kind of at the end of the day, what we're seeing is ecologic succession in real time. And what that means is that, so maybe our like fir and cedar forests are starting to shift towards more like oak and chaparral, right? Because it's getting drier and warmer. But the problem is that as you're undergoing that change, those trees are not doing well. So they're water stressed, and because they're water stressed and they're not very healthy, then they're really vulnerable to things like beetle infestations. So then you have huge stands of forests dying because the beetles are able to move in because the trees aren't very healthy, right? So then you have a bunch of trees dying, and then they're tinderboxes for naturally occurring fires, which become cataclysmic because there's all of this fuel for them. And so this is, you know, we're all experiencing this even down here in Hayward because we're experiencing those smoke events, right? But for the communities that are living there, I mean, it's burning, right? Like it's burning all over the place. And then even when it stops burning, then when you get very heavy rain events, then you're vulnerable to landslides and to all sorts of other problems.
How does climate change impact different geographical regions, and are there any areas particularly vulnerable to its effects?
Yeah, so I'm probably going to miss some of them here.
It's okay.
But there's a lot of vulnerable areas for different reasons. So areas in the high latitudes, closer to the North and South Pole, they're experiencing permafrost melt. And what that means is that the ground gets soft, and so there's a ton of infrastructure damage there. And it gets really economically challenging for communities to rebuild when their substrate just keeps melting and moving on them. And so permafrost melt is a big issue for high latitudes. But then we've got areas that experience drought conditions, historically have, and they're getting worse drought conditions. Then we have monsoon areas. These are a lot of areas that are dependent on the monsoon rains for rice production, and they don't have irrigation. As climate change happens, our monsoon rains become less predictable, which impacts rice production, which feeds billions and billions of people. And that is what has me very concerned for global food production right there, is that one.
Oh my.
Yeah, so there's that. And then, then there's just so many other places too, right? Because there's all of your low elevation islands, right? With sea level rise, there's areas that get hurricanes that are getting smacked with more frequent hurricanes and stronger hurricanes. There is, there's just kind of a myriad of different locations. There's us with fires, right? And once you kind of put all of those together, it's over 50% of our land masses, right? So climate change, like once you start putting together all the different communities that are impacted in one way or another, there's not that much land space left that's not going to get hit directly by one impact or another.
Oh man, that's very scary.
Yeah,
That's
it
very
is.
scary. What role does geography play in assessing the impact of rising sea levels on coastal regions due to climate change?
Pretty much all geographers have to take some remote sensing or GIS classes. And so you're forced to learn how to use technologies that are really useful for mapping out this type of stuff. And so you can create different data layers. So for instance, with sea level rise, you can look at the elevation. So you can model out which areas are going to be inundated with water. And you can project out based on how much sea level rise you expect to get. But then you can create another layer, right? Where you can look at areas like fire stations and hospitals and start kind of planning in advance some of those key locations that are going to be really important in dealing with supporting the communities with sea level rise. And then you can also look at layers of socioeconomics. Who's going to be hit the hardest and how do we support those communities, right? And you can just keep kind of adding other layers out, and then you put them all together and you have this like interactive layer, a graphic where you can kind of see the patterns, you can model out where people are going to be impacted, and you can start using those graphics, data-driven graphics, for creating policies and working to start trying to deal with some of that stuff in advance.
Can you discuss the role of geography in understanding climate change, adaptation strategies for the communities around the world?
I think that what really works for geography and why geography ends up so focused on issues around climate change and environmental demise at large is really understanding the scientific mechanisms behind this, but being heavily concerned with supporting the communities from a bottoms-up approach and acknowledging their wisdom and role in the process. I think that that's really key for geography in that field.
Can you discuss the relationship between agriculture and environmental sustainability?
Yeah, so agriculture is really tricky, right? Because there is a way to have regenerative, sustainable agriculture systems, and that by and large is not what we do. If you have, smaller farms, do crop rotation, there's ways to do it that's sustainable. But unfortunately, we've shifted towards like a mass production process, and we really need to step back from that, because when you mass produce with agriculture, it's what we call high input farming. And so you have to harvest all of your crops really quickly. It's really mechanized. So now we're using huge amounts of fossil fuels just to harvest and plant, right? And then to get really high crop loads, you're gonna throw fertilizer on that. And the fertilizer has nitrates and phosphates, and that makes it into the water systems. And when it gets into the water systems, it's just like you're fertilizing your garden, but you're fertilizing the oceans and the lakes. And so you get these like really quick algal blooms that take over. And then those algal blooms, they grow really fast and then they die really fast. They sink to the bottom and they use up all the oxygen in the water systems. And then the organisms in the lakes and oceans die. It creates anoxia. We're damaging our stream systems streams and our lakes and our oceans because of this high input farming. We're throwing on pesticides and herbicides, and with the pesticides, we're killing our pollinators, right? Oh, wow. So it's a very unsustainable and instant gratification technique that really needs to shift for long-term life. And this isn't just thinking about the bee populations and the other pollinators. It's about like humankind. If we completely destroy our environment, we can't live in it. And so we really need to shift the way that we do agriculture.
How can individuals contribute to sustainable practices in their daily lives?
There's little steps that you can take, and I think that it can feel really overwhelming at times. What I do, and I don't know if this is the right thing for everybody, I just try to take one step at a time, right? One of the things that it feels really important to me, and it's different for everybody, right? But for me, it's trying to not buy plastic as much as possible. So it's like every room in the house is kind of like a long-term project of like, what can I do instead of buying something in plastic in every single room of my house, and kind of working towards that. Then kind of thinking about the larger picture, right? Because there's some things that you can control in your home, and then there's a bunch of other stuff that you can't control at all. And so that's, get involved. Figure out how to get involved, supporting legislation that supports the environment. You can think about advocating small, and that can be in your home, it could be at your school, it can be as wide as you want to take it. But it's kind of a personal choice how and where you want to step in, but there's ample opportunity to do so, right?
What about just recycle?
Yeah, so our recycling system is really problematic.
Really?
So I would say try to not buy plastic.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's really much better if you just try to not buy plastic.
All right. We probably put that on the bottom of the screen. Do not buy plastic
Just don't
anymore.
buy, yeah. I mean, there's no way you cannot buy it anymore, but you can figure out how to greatly limit it.
Yeah. Or start changing the ways you are doing that.
And also try to eat vegetarian or vegan a little bit more. And that's a really small step that you can take, right? So that's an easy one. Try to buy secondhand is a great kind of solution too. So that's, some things that you can do as well.
All right. There's a bunch of ways. Check it out. What are degrees students can pursue to work towards a sustainable future?
You could go all in, right? And you could work towards an environmental studies degree or an environmental science degree or a geography degree or a geology degree or environmental engineering. There's also, I'm finding more and more that I have students that are studying architecture but are studying sustainable architecture, right? Or are studying art but are supporting sustainable art projects. If you want to do a degree where you are constantly working on doing research or advocating, then you can get one of those degrees. But you could also pursue it in any other degree that you want if you choose to do so.
I noticed you were talking about marine biology and stuff, and maybe we could get you on a later time or something to go into depth of that stuff too as well, because I know that's a whole nother topic. Is there any last words?
It's very stressful and painful to look at the status of the world and what's going on environmentally. One of the ways that we can try to combat that is find community. If it feels if this is something that you care deeply about and you feel stuck because it's really painful, get involved with groups on campus. So we have an environmental group on campus, RAGE. There's a lot of super motivated faculty and classified professionals and administrators that are all working to try to green Chabot and do cool projects where we can celebrate nature together and support one another. And I think it's totally true that this stuff is hard to deal with. And so finding a way to support one another and finding something, a small step that you can do that feels good, that allows you to celebrate the planet in one way or another is a really great way forward.
Unity for the community.
Love it.
Do you have any contacts or anything? How can we reach you, or how can we get a hold of you if we want to?
So I'm the department coordinator for geography and environmental studies and GIS, and so you can find me on Chabot's website, and my school email is there. And so please reach out if you have questions. I'd love to support.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Suzanne, and we'll hopefully get you here on a future episode. And thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
You are tuned in to Evolve the Earth Talk Show. Like, follow, and subscribe on all platforms at ETE Talk Show. Leave a comment about any subjects you would like us to discuss or questions that we can answer during our show. Join us on our next episode with Professor Scott Hildreth as we discuss how physics and astronomy is part of our everyday lives. We take our conversation to outer space and beyond. All that and more here on Evolve the Earth. I am your host, Alan Sampson. See you all on the next show.